Ink on skin is a story of where you've been, but ink on paper is a map of where you're trapped. A single word can be the difference between legacy and ruin, between empire and ash. In the velvet shadows of the Onyx Lounge's private booth, where blood was wiped away as easily as spilled wine, a murder was being prepared with nothing sharper than syntax. Maya felt it in the precise angle of Attorney Lee's red tie, like a freshly slit throat against starched white, and in the asymmetric sweat gathering at his temple despite the air conditioning's Arctic hum. She moved through the smoke and expensive tobacco like part of the furniture, her hands steady as they guided a 1982 Cabernet toward crystal, her presence engineered to be forgotten the moment she stepped away. But she was not furniture. She was a predator dressed in service whites, so observing from a vantage point no one thought to guard. Her fingers, controlled as they poured, did not reveal the electricity sparking beneath her skin. She had been silent for 3 years, ever since her former life had been burned from official records, leaving her in this monochrome survival. Tonight, however, the world was sharpening into focus again, dangerous, precise, and impossible to ignore. Maya spent 3 years invisible, convinced silence would keep her safe. Tonight, she's watching a man about to lose everything to words he doesn't see coming, the same way she once did. If you believe people who've survived betrayal deserve to have their comeback stories amplified, hit subscribe. Be counted among those who refuse to let these narratives fade into silence. Your subscription says, "Stories of resistance matter." Maya had learned to read people the way others read menus, quickly, efficiently, and with an eye for what was being hidden beneath the presentation. Attorney Lee's hand moved to his tie for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, a gesture that should have been casual, forgettable. It wasn't. The tremor was microscopic, barely a flutter in the tendons of his wrist as his fingers grazed the silk knot at his throat. Most people would have missed it entirely, written it off as a man adjusting his appearance in a high-stakes meeting. But Maya had spent 7 years in rooms where a twitch could mean an asset was compromised, where a poorly timed swallow indicated a lie was about to be told. She'd catalogued thousands of tells in her time with the State Department, micro-expressions that leaked truth no matter how tightly someone tried to seal it in. Lee's tell was pristine in its anxiety. The tie was already perfect, sitting exactly where it should against his collar. There was no reason to touch it unless touching it soothed something deeper, something frantic trying to claw its way out of his chest. She watched him from her position near the bar cart, her hands busy with the ritual of decanting. The wine needed to breathe. So did she. Across from Lee sat Jin, his posture that of a man who had never needed to prove his power because everyone in the room already knew the cost of testing it. His neck tattoos, intricate, traditional, unmistakably so, curved up from his collar like calligraphy, written in defiance. He was scanning the contract with the focused calm of someone who believed his lawyer had his best interests at heart. Maya's pulse kicked up a notch, so she knew that kind of trust. She'd had it once, for the people who'd sent her into the dark, and then locked the door behind her. Lee cleared his throat, a small sound that might have been nervousness, or it might have been performance. He slid the contract another inch toward Jin, a pen following close behind. Black lacquer, expensive, the kind of pen that signed treaties and transferals of fortune. His voice was smooth when he spoke, professionally warm, but his hand drifted back to his tie. Again. Maya tilted the decanter, watching the wine cascade into the glass with the unhurried patience of something inevitable. She'd positioned herself at an angle that gave her a clear line of sight to the document on the table. It was upside down from her perspective, but that had never been a problem. 2 years of training had taught her to read contracts, communiques, and classified briefs in any orientation, any language, sometimes in seconds. Her eyes caught on a phrase in section 4.2. Then they stopped. The word wasn't supposed to be there. The word was irrevocable. Maya's mind split in two directions at once, one part still standing in the Onyx Lounge, wine bottle in hand, the other hurtling backward through time to a cramped briefing room in Langley, where she'd first learned that language was a weapon more precise than any blade. She'd been 24, fresh out of Georgetown's linguistics programs with 3 languages and a thesis on semantic manipulation in international treaties. The recruiter had slid a contract across the table, told her to read it, then asked her what was wrong with paragraph 7. She'd found it in 11 seconds, a subordinate clause that would have legally bound her to fieldwork with no extraction guarantee. The recruiter had smiled. "You start Monday." For 7 years, she became a ghost who lived between words. They'd taught her to read documents in mirrors, upside down in peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact with a target. She'd analyzed intercepted emails in Farsi, decoded Russian oligarch contracts over blurry satellite feeds, identified forgeries in UN proposals by the rhythm of their syntax. She learned that the most dangerous lies weren't the obvious ones. They were the single words that transformed meaning, the clauses that seemed to say one thing while legally guaranteeing another. Her gift had made her indispensable. Her gift had also made her expendable. The operation in Prague should have been simple. Attend a gala, get close to a Chinese intelligence officer posing as a trade minister, and verify whether the investment documents he was carrying were genuine or part of a disinformation campaign. She'd done everything right. Made contact, gained access, photographed the contracts in a coat check room using a pen camera. The documents were fake, designed to crash European semiconductor stocks. She'd sent the intel up the chain. 24 hours later, her handler was dead. 48 hours later, her credentials were scrubbed, her apartment cleaned out, and her name was on a kill list that didn't officially exist. Someone high up had wanted those stocks to crash. Someone had decided she knew too much. She'd burned her SIM card, cut her hair in a gas station bathroom outside Vienna, and disappeared into the kind of work where no one asked questions and often everyone was running from something. The Onyx Lounge had been a refuge for 3 years, a place where she could be invisible, unremarkable, safe. But old instincts didn't die. Soon they just waited. Maya blinked, and she was back in the present, smoke curling through expensive air, Jin's hand hovering over the pen, Lee's tie being adjusted for the 4th time. Section 4.2 glared at her from the page, the word irrevocable sitting where conditional should have been. It was a ghost clause, a trap door hidden in legalese, and the moment Jin's signature touched that paper, his empire would belong to someone else. Maya set the decanter down, with a precision that belied the chaos unraveling inside her chest. She stepped back from the table, her movements fluid and unremarkable, the choreography of a server who had poured 1,000 glasses and would pour 1,000 more. No one looked at her as she slipped through the velvet curtain that separated the private booths from the kitchen. The fluorescent lights hit her like an interrogation. She crossed to the steel prep counter, gripping its edge, her knuckles going white against the cold metal. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of a hanging copper pot. Distorted, unfamiliar, a woman who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of being no one. Walk away. The thought arrived with the cold clarity of survival instinct. This isn't your fight. Jin was a criminal. Well, not in the petty sense, not in the way that could be rehabilitated with community service and a good lawyer. He ran an empire built on calculated violence, on the kind of power that made governments nervous and rivals disappear. Saving him wasn't heroism. It was choosing a side in a war she'd already lost once, but Attorney Lee was something worse. He was a traitor dressed in legitimacy, the kind of man who shook your hand while signing your death warrant. The ghost clause wasn't just theft, it was assassination by paperwork, a betrayal so elegant it would never leave a trace. Jin would wake up one morning to discover his shipping lanes belonged to someone else, his legacy dissolved into legal footnotes, and by then Lee would be on a beach somewhere spending his commission. Maya had seen this before. In Prague, in Berlin, till in a dozen other cities where people who trusted the wrong words ended up in unmarked graves. Her hands were shaking now, a tremor she couldn't control. She pressed them flat against the counter, willing them still. If she walked back out there and said nothing, she would be complicit, silent, safe. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She'd spent 3 years convincing herself that silence was survival, that keeping her head down meant staying alive. But silence had its own body count, didn't it? Every time she'd ignored the conversation at table 7 about the shipment coming through the port. Every time she'd pretended not to understand the Mandarin negotiations happening over dessert. Every time she'd chosen invisibility over intervention. She'd told herself it was different, that she wasn't responsible for what happened in rooms she only served. But this was happening right in front of her, and she knew. She saw the trap with the same clarity she'd once used to save diplomats and dismantle espionage rings. Doing nothing now wasn't neutrality. It was permission. Maya looked at her reflection one last time. The woman staring back wasn't invisible anymore. She was just deciding whether to exist again. She picked up a fresh bottle of wine and walked back through the curtain. The bottle she chose was a 2005 Barolo, the kind of wine that demanded ceremony. It was older, denser, full of sediment that would cloud the glass if poured too quickly. Perfect for what she needed. Time. Maya cradled it like something sacred as she returned to the booth. Her heartbeat steady now, her decision made. The weight of the bottle grounded her, gave her hands something to do that didn't betray the adrenaline singing through her veins. She approached the table with the same practiced deference she'd worn like armor for 3 years, but beneath it, every nerve was awake. Jin had the pen in his hand now, his eyes scanning the final page of the contract. Lee sat across from him, that red tie still perfectly knotted, his expression calibrated to convey trustworthy competence. He didn't look at Maya as she arrived. Neither did Jin. She was furniture again, part of the room's expensive decor. Good. She set a fresh glass in front of Jin with a soft clink of crystal against wood. Then began the ritual. The Barolo needed to breathe, needed to be coaxed from the bottle in a slow, deliberate stream that would take minutes, not seconds. She tilted the neck at precisely the right angle, watching the dark wine begin its journey into the decanter, a languid cascade that caught the low amber light of the booth. The pour gave her cover. It gave her proximity. Most importantly, it gave her an excuse to stay. She positioned herself at Jin's right shoulder, close enough to the faint scent of his cologne, something woody, expensive, understated, mixed with the tobacco smoke. From this vantage point, she could see the contract clearly. Section 4.2 sat there like a loaded gun, waiting. Lee was talking, his voice smooth as the wine flowing from her hands. Everything is standard, Mr. Jin. The indemnity clause protects you fully, and the transfer timeline gives you complete operational control during the transition period. Lies dressed in soothing tones. Maya's eyes tracked the words on the page as she poured. Irrevocable transfer of all operational assets, where it should have read, conditional upon board approval. The difference was a chasm. One gave Jin an exit, the other was a trap door with no bottom. The wine continued its slow descent into the decanter, dark as old blood. She counted the seconds. 15, 20, 30. Jin was reading the signature page now, the pen poised. Lee's hand drifted to his tie again, that microscopic tremor back in his fingers. Maya had maybe a minute before the pour was complete, or maybe less before Jin's pen touched paper and the trap snapped shut. She leaned forward slightly, as if adjusting the angle of the decanter, and let her voice drop to barely more than a breath, low enough that only Jin could hear, precise enough that every syllable landed exactly where it needed to. The ink is a cage, Mr. Jin. Maya had leaned in close enough that her breath ghosted across Jin's ear, her voice pitched low enough to be swallowed by the ambient noise of the lounge. To Lee, to anyone watching from across the room, she was simply a server ensuring the wine was poured to perfection. But the words she whispered were surgical, deliberate, and delivered in flawless Korean, the formal register reserved for addressing someone of Jin's stature. "Look at section 4.2, she murmured, her tone carrying the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were risking. "It says irrevocable. It should say conditional." Jin's hand froze above the signature line, the pen hovering like a held breath. He didn't turn toward her, didn't acknowledge her presence with so much as a glance, but Maya felt the shift in his posture, the subtle straightening of his spine, or the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A predator recognizing the scent of danger. She continued, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had once dismantled international conspiracies with nothing but syntax and timing. "If you sign this contract, you lose everything." The wine finished its pour, the last drops falling into the glass, with a finality that mirrored the decision she'd just made. Maya straightened, set the decanter down with care, and stepped back into her role. Invisible, forgettable, safe. Except she wasn't safe anymore. Jin placed the pen on the table, the soft click of lacquer against wood cutting through Lee's monologue about quarterly projections and operational efficiencies. The attorney's voice stumbled, trailing off as he registered the change in atmosphere, the way the air had turned sharp and cold. "Mr. Jin?" Lee's professional smile was still in place, but his hand drifted to his tie again, that telltale tremor now impossible to hide. "Is there something?" Section 4.2. Jin's voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the kind of authority that made the question irrelevant. "Read it to me." Lee's eyes flicked to the contract, then back to Jin, his expression arranging itself into something meant to convey helpful confusion. "Of course, it's the standard indemnity clause we discussed." Word for word, Attorney Lee. The temperature in the booth dropped 10 degrees. Maya watched Lee's hand shake as he reached for the contract, and watched the sweat that had been gathering at his temple break free and slide down toward his collar. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The language is technical, Mr. Jin, but the intent is clearly word for word." Maya stood perfectly still, the empty wine bottle cradled in her hands, watching the moment she'd engineered unfold with the inevitability of a spring-loaded trap. Lee's eyes were on the page now, scanning desperately for an exit that didn't exist, and Jin's gaze had gone flat and cold, the look of a man who just realized he'd been eating at a table with a viper. The fuse was burning, and there was no putting it out now. Maya just risked everything she spent 3 years protecting. Her silence, her safety, her invisibility. She chose truth over survival because some betrayals can't go unanswered. If you believe people who speak up when others stay silent deserve to have their stories amplified, hit subscribe. Be counted among those who refuse to watch injustice unfold quietly. Your subscription says, "Voices like Maya's matter." Lee's voice came out strangled, the words catching in his throat like broken glass. Section 4.2 states that upon execution of this agreement, all operational assets, including but not limited to shipping routes, port access contracts, and subsidiary holdings, shall undergo irrevocable transfer to... Stop. Jin's hand rose from the table, a single gesture that had the finality of a judge's gavel. His eyes hadn't left Lee's face, and in that gaze Maya recognized something she'd seen before in interrogation rooms and black sites. The cold mathematics of a man calculating exactly how much someone's betrayal was going to cost them. Lee's mouth snapped shut. The red tie at his throat looked obscene now, garish against his rapidly paling skin. Jin leaned back in his seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He unfolded his hands with the careful deliberation of someone performing a ritual. When he spoke again, his voice had shed every trace of warmth, every pretense of civility. It was the voice of a man who'd built an empire by knowing exactly when to show mercy and when to demonstrate why mercy was a gift, not a right. "How long have you been my attorney, Mr. Lee?" 12 years, Mr. Jin." Lee's professional composure was fracturing at the edges, his hands pressed flat against the table as if the surface could anchor him against what was coming. 12 years. Jin let the number hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. "And in those 12 years, how many contracts have you prepared for me?" Hundreds, sir. I've always—" "And did you think," Jin continued, his tone conversational now, almost curious, "that in 12 years I would not learn to recognize when someone was lying to me?" The booth felt smaller suddenly, the shadows pressing in from the edges. Maya stood motionless near the bar cart, barely breathing, acutely aware that she was witnessing something most people didn't live to describe. The other man at the table? Jin's associate, the one in the navy suit who'd been silent throughout, shifted slightly, his hand moving beneath his jacket with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. Lee saw the movement. His eyes went wide, animal panic finally breaking through the veneer of professional dignity. "Mr. Jin, please, I can explain. There's been a misunderstanding." "Irrevocable." Jin picked up the contract, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "That's not a misunderstanding, mister." "Sigh, Lee. That's not even a mistake. That's betrayal dressed in fine print." He let the pages fall back to the table with a soft whisper of expensive paper. "Who paid you?" Lee's silence was answer enough. Jin nodded once, a gesture so subtle it barely registered, but the man in the navy suit was already standing, already moving around the table with the efficient purposefulness of someone executing a well-rehearsed protocol. "Wait!" Jin's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. The man in the navy suit paused mid-step, his hand still inside his jacket. "I want to hear it, all of it, every word of Section 4.2. Lee's face had gone the color of old parchment, sweat now running freely down his temples. His hands trembled as they hovered over the contract, unable to touch it, unable to pull away. "Mr. Jin, I understand you're upset, but if indemnification and asset transfer protocol. Upon execution of this agreement, all operational assets, including but not limited to shipping routes, deepwater port access contracts, warehouse facilities in Seoul, Busan, and—" his voice cracked, "and Los Angeles, as well as all subsidiary holdings and associated intellectual property rights, shall undergo irrevocable transfer of controlling interest to Hanjin Consolidated Partners, effective immediately upon signature, with no grace period, no conditional review, and no—" he choked on the next words, "no right of rescission or appeal." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the lounge seemed to have been swallowed by the void opening up at the table. Maya felt it then, the precise moment when Jin understood the full scope of the trap. This wasn't just theft. It was erasure. So everything he'd built, every route he'd negotiated, every deal he'd brokered with blood and strategy, would belong to Hanjin the second his signature dried on the page. And Hanjin Consolidated wasn't just a competitor. They were the wolves who'd been circling his territory for 5 years, waiting for an opening. Lee had been the opening. Jin's expression didn't change, but his hands moved to the contract with a deliberateness that made Lee flinch. He flipped back through the pages, his eyes scanning the previous sections, and Maya knew what he was finding, the careful scaffolding of language that made the ghost clause look legitimate. And Section 2.4 referenced standard transfer protocols as outlined in Section 4.2. Section 3.1 mentioned irrevocable commitments to operational partnership. The poison had been distributed throughout the document, small enough doses that no single phrase would trigger alarm, but together they formed a perfect killing machine. "And Jin said softly, almost to himself. Then his eyes snapped to Lee. "Do-Yun Park. He's behind this." Lee's silence was confirmation. His body had gone rigid, trapped between the instinct to run and the knowledge that running would only make what came next worse. Jin smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Maya had ever seen. The man in the navy suit moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Lee was escorted from the booth without ceremony, without violence, just a firm hand on his elbow and a quiet word in Korean that made the attorney's remaining resistance evaporate. He went silently, his red tie the last splash of color Maya saw before the velvet curtain fell closed behind them. The booth felt cavernous in their absence. Jin sat alone now, the contract still spread before him like evidence at a crime scene. He reached into his jacket, produced a gold lighter, something vintage, engraved, and held the flame to the corner of the document. The paper caught immediately, curling and blackening as fire consumed the ghost claws. The betrayal, the entire architecture of Lee's treachery. Maya stood frozen by the bar cart, still holding the empty wine bottle, unsure if she was supposed to leave or stay or simply cease to exist. Her cover was blown. Her 3 years of safety had just gone up in smoke along with that contract. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to run, to disappear into whatever hole she could find before Jin decided that loose ends needed tying. But she didn't move. Couldn't. Not while he sat there watching the flames, with an expression that gave nothing away. The last of the contract crumbled into ash. Jin set the lighter on the table with a soft click, then finally, looked at her. "You speak Korean well," he said in English, his accent precise, his tone unreadable. "Formal register, high-level education, not something you learn from a language app." Maya's throat felt like sandpaper. "I studied. Georgetown, I would guess. Maybe Yale." He tilted his head slightly, studying her the way she'd been studying people her entire career. "Linguistics program. Government recruiter found you before graduation. State Department, probably. Or something that pretended to be State Department." The blood drained from her face. He smiled at her reaction. Not the terrifying smile from before, but something smaller, almost rueful. "I knew you weren't a waitress the first week you started here," Jin continued. "The way you moved through rooms, the way you listened to conversations you pretended not to understand. I've been in this business long enough to recognize someone running from something." He paused. "I just didn't know if you were running from me or running to me." Maya found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "I wasn't running to anyone, so I was trying to survive. And yet you risked that survival. For me." He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Why?" "Because—" She stopped, searching for words that weren't completely honest but weren't entirely lies either. "Because I've seen too many people get destroyed by the ones they trust." Jin nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. He reached into his jacket again, this time producing a business card. Black, minimal, embossed with silver characters. He held it out to her. "I need someone who can read the words people hide between the lines." Maya stared at the card in Jin's outstretched hand, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences with the trained efficiency of someone who'd spent years calculating survival odds. Taking that card meant stepping back into the world she'd spent 3 years hiding from. It meant becoming visible again, valuable again. And value, she'd learned the hard way, made you a target. But staying here, continuing to pour wine and pretend she was invisible, that was its own kind of death, wasn't it? A slow erasure, a life lived in the margins of other people's power plays while she told herself that silence was safety. She'd already broken that silence tonight. The moment she'd whispered in Jin's ear, she'd stopped being invisible. There was no going back to the monochrome existence she'd built. So the only question now was whether she moved forward on her own terms or waited for the consequences to find her. Maya reached out and took the card. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind that conveyed seriousness. His name was embossed in silver, Jin Woo Park, along with a phone number and nothing else. No title, no company name. People who needed to know already knew. "I have conditions," she said, her voice steadier now. Jin's eyebrow rose slightly. "You're negotiating." "I don't work in the dark. If I'm reading contracts for you, I need to know who the real players are. No compartmentalization, no need-to-know restrictions. I can't spot traps if I don't understand the full context." "Agreed. And I don't carry out operations. I find the problems, I tell you what they are, and what you do with that information is your decision. I'm not an asset. I'm a consultant." Jin considered this, his fingers drumming once against the table. "You want clean hands. I want clear boundaries." He smiled, genuinely this time, something almost approaching respect. "You'll have them. Anything else? If someone comes for me, someone from my old life, you don't ask questions. You just make sure they don't find me." "Done." He stood, buttoning his jacket with the precise movements of someone for whom every gesture was deliberate. "Start tomorrow. I have a shipping contract with a Taiwanese conglomerate that feels wrong. I need you to tell me why." Maya set down the wine bottle she'd been clutching like a talisman for the last 20 minutes. Her hands found the buttons of her server's jacket. White, crisp, and anonymous, and she slipped it off with the finality of someone shedding a skin that no longer fit. Beneath it, she wore a simple black shirt, unremarkable but hers. She draped the jacket over the bar cart, a flag of surrender to a life she was done living. "I'll need access to your legal team's files," she said. "Everything Lee touched in the last 6 months. You'll have it by morning." Jin moved toward the exit, pausing at the velvet curtain to look back at her one last time. "Welcome back, Ms. Maya." She didn't give him a last name. Maybe someday. Just Maya. He nodded, understanding passing between them, the recognition of two people who knew what it meant to exist in the spaces between identities. Then he was gone, and Maya stood alone in the empty booth surrounded by wine glasses and ash. No longer invisible, no longer safe, but for the first time in 3 years, no longer silent. She picked up Jin's card and slipped it into her pocket. Tomorrow she'd be someone new again. Tonight, she was simply someone who decided to exist. Maya walked away from safety and chose to exist again, on her own terms. Stories about people who rebuild themselves after the world tried to erase them don't go viral by accident. They spread because people like you decide they're worth amplifying. If you stand with survivors who refuse to stay silent, subscribe. Don't just witness her journey. Be part of the community that says stories like this deserve to be heard.